November 20th, 1943, 0340 hours, Philippine Sea, 48 kilometers southwest of Leyte Gulf. Commander Takeo Miki stood in the control room of I-19 and listened to the sound that every submarine commander feared. Propellers, not one set, not two, 12. Through the steel hull, through 100 meters of seawater, the rhythm reached him. The methodical churning of destroyer screws, sweeping back and forth in a search pattern that had been running for 17 hours without pause. Mickey's hydrophone operator sat motionless at his station, headphones pressed against his ears, tracking the contacts. 4 destroyers to the north, 3 to the east, 2 to the south, 3 more to the west. A perfect circle, a cage of steel and explosives with I-19 trapped at the center. The submarine had been submerged since 10:15 the previous morning, 19 hours underwater, battery charge at 42%, air quality degrading, carbon dioxide levels climbing, crew exhausted, and the destroyers had not left. They had not given up. They had not moved on to easier targets. They simply hunted with a patience and precision that Miki had never encountered in 3 years of Pacific combat. Commander Takeo Miki was 41 years old, graduate of the Imperial Japanese Naval Academy, class of 1922. He had commanded I-19 for 14 months. In that time, he had sunk the aircraft carrier USS Wasp, 15,000 tons. He had torpedoed the battleship USS North Carolina, putting her out of action for 2 months of critical repairs. He had destroyed the destroyer USS O'Brien, which had limped away from his torpedoes only to break apart and sink a month later. 3 major American warships, medals, commendations, recognition from the Naval General Staff in Tokyo. He knew his trade. He knew how to hunt. He knew how to kill. But now, in the pre-dawn darkness of November 20th, 1943, he was learning something new. He was learning what it felt like to be the prey. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The American destroyers were using a tactic that Miki had first encountered 3 months earlier, but which had now become standard procedure for U.S. Navy anti-submarine operations. They called it the persistent hunt. The concept was simple and utterly ruthless. Once a submarine was detected, American destroyers would not break contact. They would not be distracted by other targets. They would not conserve fuel or worry about their own vulnerability. They would simply hunt until the submarine surfaced, surrendered, or died. For the Japanese submarine force, this represented a fundamental change in the nature of Pacific warfare. In 1941 and 1942, submarine operations had followed predictable patterns. A boat would approach a convoy or naval formation, fire torpedoes, then dive and evade. The escorts would respond with depth charges, perhaps an hour of searching, maybe 2, but eventually they would return to their convoy. They had to. The merchants needed protection. The warships needed escorts. Individual submarines, even if detected, could not be pursued indefinitely. There were always other priorities, other threats, other demands on limited escort resources. By late 1943, those limitations had disappeared. The United States Navy had built so many destroyers, destroyer escorts, and patrol craft that they could afford to dedicate multiple ships to hunting a single submarine for as long as it took. American shipyards were launching a new destroyer escort every 10 days. Every 10 days. A complete warship, from keel laying to commissioning, in the time it took I-19 to complete a single patrol. The mathematics of that production capacity meant that American anti-submarine doctrine had evolved beyond mere defense. It had become annihilation. Miki had read the intelligence reports from Combined Fleet Headquarters. In September 1943, the Imperial Japanese Navy had lost 7 submarines. In October, 9 more. November was not yet finished, and already 6 boats had failed to return from patrol. I-19 might become the 7th. These were not acceptable losses. These were catastrophic. Japan had begun the war with 63 ocean-going submarines. The fleet had expanded to nearly 100 boats by mid-1943, but construction could not keep pace with losses. Japanese shipyards could build perhaps 4 submarines per month, and that pace was slowing as Allied bombing raids disrupted production and raw materials became scarce. The Americans were destroying boats faster than Japan could replace them, and they were doing it with a systematic efficiency that felt less like naval warfare and more like industrial extermination. I-19's detection had occurred the previous morning at 10:07 hours. The submarine had been running at periscope depth, 30 meters below the surface, approaching what Miki's navigation officer had identified as a small convoy. 6 merchants, visible on the horizon, moving northeast toward Leyte at 8 knots. Light escort, maybe 2 destroyers. A target worth the risk. Miki had ordered the submarine to increase speed to 7 knots, closing the range to firing position, standard approach. He had done this dozens of times. At 10:14 hours, the sonar operator had reported a new contact. Fast screws, high-speed approach, bearing 090. A destroyer, sprinting toward their position at 25 knots. Miki had ordered an immediate dive to 80 meters. The submarine descended. The destroyer passed overhead, and then it turned. That turn told Miki everything. The American ship had not stumbled across I-19 by accident. It had not detected the submarine at the last moment. It had known. It had known I-19's position. Before the submarine had even seen the convoy, the destroyer had been waiting. Within 20 minutes, more destroyers had arrived. By 1100 hours, Miki counted 8 separate propeller signatures surrounding his boat. By 1400 hours, there were 12. They had formed a search pattern centered on I-19's last known position, a rotating grid of overlapping sonar sweeps that made evasion nearly impossible. Miki had tried. He had ordered the submarine to creep northeast at 2 knots, barely moving, minimizing noise. The destroyers adjusted their pattern and followed. He had tried northwest. They followed. He had tried to go deep, descending to 150 meters near I-19's maximum rated depth. The destroyers simply waited overhead, tracking him with their sonar, coordinating their positions through radio communication that Miki could not intercept and could not jam. At 1800 hours the previous evening, Miki had shut down all non-essential systems, electric motors reduced to minimal power, air circulation fans turned off, crew ordered to remain at their stations without moving. Silence. Complete silence. It had not mattered. The destroyers had not lost contact. Through the long hours of darkness, November 19th into November 20th, the hunt had continued. Miki stood in the control room and tried to understand what had changed. How were they finding him? I-19's hull was steel, yes, but it was well maintained. No unusual vibrations. The electric motors were German-designed, efficient and quiet. The crew was experienced, disciplined. They knew how to maintain silent running procedures, and yet the Americans tracked them with a confidence that seemed almost casual. Every time Miki altered course, within 30 minutes, the destroyer pattern adjusted to compensate. Every time he changed depth, the sonar pings found him again. It was as if the Americans could see through 100 meters of ocean, through steel and water and darkness, and mark exactly where I-19 drifted. What Miki could not know, what Japanese naval intelligence had not yet fully understood, was that by November 1943, the United States had deployed a new generation of sonar technology that rendered older submarine evasion tactics obsolete. The Americans called it QC sonar, a high-frequency active system that could detect submarines at ranges exceeding 2,000 meters in good water conditions. Unlike earlier sonar sets that provided only rough bearings, QC sonar could determine a target's range, depth, and movement with enough precision to guide depth charge attacks without visual contact. American operators trained for 6 months specifically on this equipment. They learned to distinguish submarine echoes from schools of fish, from thermal layers, from rocky bottom features. They practiced tracking submerged targets through every possible evasion maneuver. But the sonar was only half of the system. The other half was coordination. Each destroyer in the search pattern was linked by radio to a hunt commander, typically the senior destroyer captain. That commander received position reports from all ships simultaneously, plotted them on a tactical chart, and directed the search pattern in real time. If one destroyer lost sonar contact, others maintained it. If the submarine tried to slip between two ships, a third would move to block the escape route. The pattern was self-correcting, adaptive, relentless. For I-19, trapped at the center of this coordinated hunt, the result was a cage that tightened with every hour. At 0400 hours, 20 hours since the initial detection, Mickey's executive officer approached him quietly. The man's uniform was soaked with sweat despite the cold. Temperature in the control room had dropped to 14 degrees Celsius as the ventilation systems remained offline. But every man aboard was sweating. Stress, fear, carbon dioxide accumulation. "Commander," the executive officer said softly, "battery at 38%, air quality is critical. Recommend surfacing within 6 hours maximum." Mickey nodded. He'd been tracking the same numbers. I-19 could remain submerged for perhaps another 8 hours if they continued to minimize power consumption. But the crew's endurance was failing faster than the batteries. Men were collapsing at their stations. The carbon dioxide concentration had reached a level that caused headaches, nausea, impaired judgment. If he waited too long, his crew would be incapable of fighting, even if they did surface. 6 hours, Mickey agreed. "If they have not left by 1000 hours, we surface and fight." The executive officer's expression did not change. Both men understood what surfacing meant. I-19 carried a single deck gun, 14 centimeters, effective range, perhaps 12,000 meters, against surface targets. The American destroyers had 5-inch guns, 12.7 centimeters, but with faster firing rates and radar-directed fire control, they could hit I-19 before the submarine's crew could even man their deck gun. Surfacing was not a tactical decision. It was suicide with extra steps. But remaining submerged until the crew suffocated was not preferable. At 05:15 hours, the first depth charge attack began. Mickey heard the splashes first. The distinct sound of canisters hitting the water transmitted through the hull. Then the detonations. 4 explosions, spaced at 5-second intervals, depth set for approximately 75 meters. I-19 was at 110 meters. The shock waves reached the submarine as a series of hammering concussions. The lights flickered, deck plates vibrated. Men grabbed stanchions to keep their footing. Mickey checked the depth gauge. Still 110 meters. Hull integrity maintained. Damage control, report. The responses came from each station. Forward torpedo room, no damage. After torpedo room, no damage. Engine room, no damage. The attack had been poorly aimed, or perhaps it had been a ranging shot, a test to see if the submarine would react, would try to evade, would give the destroyers better tracking data. Mickey ordered all stations to maintain position, do not react. The second attack came at 0532. 8 depth charges, this time delivered in a walking pattern that marched toward I-19's position. The first 4 exploded to the north. The second 4 exploded directly overhead, closer, much closer. The detonations felt like a giant fist striking the submarine's hull. Light fixtures shattered, fragments of glass scattered across the control room deck. A pipe joint in the galley ruptured, spraying seawater under pressure until damage control teams sealed it. One man in the after torpedo room suffered a broken arm when the concussion threw him against a torpedo rack. Mickey felt the submarine roll slightly, pushed by the force of the explosions. Still 110 meters, still intact, but the Americans were refining their aim. At 0600 hours, dawn broke over the Philippine Sea. Mickey could not see it, buried beneath 100 meters of water, but he knew the sun was rising because the attack pattern changed. The depth charges stopped. The propeller noise reorganized. 2 destroyers moved to the north, increasing range. 2 more moved south. The encirclement loosened slightly. They were waiting for something. At 0620 hours, Mickey's sonar operator reported a new contact. Aircraft, single engine, low altitude, circling. The Americans had brought in air support, a patrol bomber. probably a PBY Catalina, or perhaps one of the newer PV Ventura types, equipped with radar and sonar buoys. The aircraft would drop acoustic sensors into the water, listening devices that could detect submarine engine noise and transmit the data back to the plane and to the destroyers. Even I-19's minimal electrical power would register on those sensors. Even the sound of men breathing, of pumps maintaining hull pressure, would be detected and analyzed and converted into targeting data for the ships above. Commander Takeo Miki stood in the control room of I-19 and understood that the situation had transitioned from dangerous to hopeless. 21 hours submerged, battery at 34%, air quality approaching lethal concentration, crew deteriorating, 12 destroyers maintaining contact, aircraft overhead, and somewhere in the darkness of the Pacific, 8 other Japanese submarines were experiencing the same nightmare. Miki did not yet know their names. He did not know their commanders or their patrol areas or their specific fates, but he knew, with the certainty that comes from years of naval service, that I-19 was not unique. This was not an isolated incident. This level of American anti-submarine capability, this systematic hunting efficiency, was being applied across the entire Pacific theater, and the Imperial Japanese Navy's submarine force, the weapon that was supposed to strangle Allied supply lines and sink enemy carriers and turn the tide of the war, was being methodically destroyed. The American anti-submarine system that was killing I-19 had not appeared overnight. It had been built across 2 years of trial, failure, refinement, and massive industrial investment. In December 1941, when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, the United States Navy's anti-submarine capabilities had been primitive. The standard depth charge was a 300-pound canister set to detonate at a pre-selected depth. The standard sonar was short-ranged and unreliable. The standard doctrine was reactive, escort ships responding to attacks, but rarely hunting submarines aggressively. By November 1943, every element of that system had been revolutionized. The depth charges were now 600 pounds, carried in racks that could deliver patterns of 8 or more charges simultaneously. The fuses were improved, detonating at precise depths with minimal failure rate. Some destroyers now carried ahead-throwing weapons, mortars that fired depth charges forward of the ship, allowing attacks without losing sonar contact by passing over the target. The sonar had evolved from crude ranging equipment to precision tracking systems. QC sonar could hold contact on a submarine through evasive maneuvers that would have broken lock in 1941. Operators could distinguish between genuine submarine contacts and false returns with confidence that had required years of training to develop. The doctrine had become ruthlessly focused. When a submarine was detected, it was marked for death, not deterrence, not suppression. Extermination. Destroyer divisions practiced coordinated hunts in training exercises that lasted days. They learned to maintain contact through every evasion technique submarines might attempt. They learned to coordinate attacks across multiple ships, compressing the area where a submarine could hide until there was nowhere left to run. And behind all of this, supporting everything, was American industrial capacity operating at a scale that Japan simply could not match. In 1943, the United States launched 87 destroyers and destroyer escorts. 87. That same year, Japan launched 9. The disparity was so vast it was difficult to comprehend. For every submarine Japan sent on patrol, the United States could assign 4, 5, sometimes 6 escorts to hunt it. For every boat lost, America's anti-submarine crews gained experience, refined their tactics, improved their coordination. The learning curve was steep, but the United States had enough ships and enough time to climb it. Japan had neither. At 0700 hours, Commander Miki made his decision. All hands, prepare to surface. Man the deck gun. Prepare to engage. The executive officer stared at him. Commander, we will not suffocate in this steel coffin, Miki said quietly. We surface. We fight if we die. We die in sunlight. The order passed through the submarine. Men moved to their stations with slow, exhausted movements. 23 hours submerged. Carbon dioxide poisoning. Oxygen deprivation. Some crew members could barely stand. But they moved. They prepared. At 0715 hours, I-19 began to rise from the depths. The ballast tanks vented compressed air with a roar that every man aboard could feel through the deck plates. 7 tons of seawater displaced in 90 seconds. I-19 rose through the layers of ocean that had hidden her for nearly a full day. 100 meters, 80 meters, 60 meters. The hydrophone operator reported the destroyers reacting immediately. All contacts, increasing speed, converging on our position. They had been waiting for this moment. At 40 meters, Miki ordered the submarine to level off briefly. He needed to slow the ascent, needed to give his deck gun crew a few extra seconds to prepare. Through the hull, he could hear the destroyers closing, propeller noise building from a distant rhythm to a thundering crescendo. At 20 meters, he gave the final order. Surface, emergency surface. I-19 broke through into daylight at 0718 hours. Water cascaded off the conning tower. The forward hatch blew open. Miki climbed the ladder with his bridge crew, emerging into brilliant tropical sunlight that blinded him after 23 hours in red-lit darkness. He forced his eyes to adjust. What he saw confirmed his assessment. 12 American destroyers, arranged in a loose circle at ranges from 3,000 to 8,000 meters. Every one of them was turning toward I-19. Every one of them was accelerating to flank speed. The nearest destroyer, a Fletcher-class ship with the hull number DD-537 painted on her bow, was already firing. The first salvo shrieked overhead, 5-inch shells passing 30 meters above the conning tower. The shells hit the water 200 meters beyond I-19, throwing up geysers of white spray, ranging shots. The next salvo would be on target. Miki shouted down the hatch. He manned the deck gun. All speed ahead, hard to starboard. I-19's diesel engines coughed, caught, roared to life. Black exhaust poured from the vents. The submarine began to turn, trying to present a smaller profile, trying to make herself a harder target. The deck gun crew emerged through the forward hatch and sprinted to their weapon. 8 men. They moved with exhausted desperation, loading the first shell, traversing the gun toward the nearest destroyer. The American ship fired again. This time, the shells hit. 2 rounds struck the water 10 meters short of I-19, throwing up massive columns of spray that drenched the bridge crew. 1 shell hit the base of the conning tower, penetrating thin steel plating, detonating inside the radio room below. The explosion was muffled but devastating. Miki felt the submarine shudder. Smoke poured from the bridge hatch. I-19's deck gun fired its first shot. The 14-centimeter shell arced across 3,000 meters of ocean and fell harmlessly into the sea, 200 meters wide of the target. The crew reloaded. 12 seconds. They fired again. Another miss. The American destroyers were not missing. DD-537 fired a third salvo. 5 shells. 3 hit the water near I-19. 2 hit the submarine directly. 1 struck the forward deck, blowing a hole through the pressure hull. Seawater began flooding into the forward torpedo room. The second shell hit the conning tower's aft section, killing 2 of Miki's bridge lookouts instantly. A third destroyer, approaching from the east, opened fire. 8 shells in a single salvo. The concentration of fire was overwhelming. I-19's deck gun crew managed 1 more shot before a 5-inch shell struck their position directly. The explosion obliterated the gun and everyone manning it. Miki watched the men disappear in a flash of fire and steel fragments. Forward compartments flooding. His executive officer shouted from below, "Cannot control the damage. We're going down." Miki looked at the destroyers closing from every direction. More were firing now. Shells were hitting the water all around the submarine. Some were striking I-19 directly. The submarine was dying, shattered, burning, flooding. There would be no escape. "Abandon ship," Miki ordered. "All hands, abandon ship." And the crew began to pour from the hatches. Men climbed onto the tilting deck as seawater rushed into the hull. I-19 was settling by the bow, the forward sections dragged down by flooding compartments. Some men jumped into the ocean immediately. Others hesitated, clinging to the hull, unwilling to abandon their boat even as she sank beneath them. Commander Takeo Miki stood on the bridge and watched the American destroyers close the range. They were still firing, still killing. Men died in the water, struck by shell fragments. Men died on the deck, unable to escape before the submarine rolled. At 07:23 hours, 5 minutes after surfacing, I-19's bow went under. The stern lifted from the water, propellers still turning, diesels still running. Then the angle steepened. The conning tower submerged. Miki felt the cold water rise around him. He did not swim away. He stood at his post as the submarine took him down. I-19 sank in 400 meters of water. 87 of her crew went with her. 31 men survived to be pulled from the ocean by American sailors. Commander Takeo Miki was not among the survivors. The loss of I-19 was not an isolated incident. It was one data point in a statistical catastrophe that was destroying Japan's submarine force. November 19, 1943, one day before I-19's death, submarine I-21 was detected by American destroyers south of Tarawa. The hunt lasted 16 hours. I-21 surfaced and attempted to fight. She was sunk by gunfire in 8 minutes. 45 crew killed. November 21st, 2 days after. I-19 submarine I-35 was caught by destroyers northwest of the Gilbert Islands. The hunt lasted 11 hours. I-35 never surfaced. She was depth-charged until her hull imploded at depth. All hands lost. November 23rd, submarine I-19's sister ship, I-15, was detected approaching a convoy east of the Admiralty Islands. 4 destroyers hunted her for 14 hours. I-15 attempted to escape by diving to maximum depth. The Americans simply waited, maintaining sonar contact, dropping depth charges in calculated patterns until I-15's batteries died and she was forced to surface. She was destroyed by gunfire and depth charges dropped alongside the sinking hull. No survivors. November 25th, submarine I-40 was detected by a patrol aircraft that dropped sonobuoys around her position, then vectored in destroyers. The hunt lasted 9 hours. I-40 never had a chance to fire a single torpedo. November 26th, submarine I-31 was hunted for 22 hours by a coordinated group of 3 destroyers and 2 destroyer escorts. When she finally surfaced, she was so close to the nearest American ship that the destroyer rammed her, crushing the submarine's hull and dragging her under. November 27th, submarine I-39 was caught in a night surface attack by American destroyers equipped with radar. The Japanese boat never saw her killers. She was illuminated by searchlights at 1,000 meters and destroyed by gunfire before she could dive. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. 8 submarines lost in 9 days, nearly 600 trained submariners killed. This was not the gradual attrition of extended warfare. This was industrial annihilation, applied with systematic precision. The Imperial Japanese Navy had begun the war with a submarine force designed to accomplish strategic objectives, hunt enemy carriers, sink capital ships, interdict supply lines. By late 1943, those objectives had become impossible to achieve because the submarines could not survive long enough to reach their targets. The statistics were merciless. In 1942, Japan lost 21 submarines. In 1943, the losses climbed to 24 boats. But those numbers concealed a more terrible truth. Most of the 1943 losses occurred in the final 4 months of the year, August through November. The casualty rate was accelerating. By December 1943, the Imperial Japanese Navy's submarine force had been reduced to approximately 70 operational boats, but operational was a misleading term. Many of those boats were older designs, obsolete, with limited range and endurance. Many were committed to supply missions, carrying food and ammunition to isolated garrisons bypassed by the American advance. Only about 40 submarines remained available for offensive combat patrols. Against those 40 boats, the United States Navy deployed over 300 destroyers and destroyer escorts in the Pacific Theater, plus hundreds of patrol aircraft, plus submarines of their own operating in offensive roles against Japanese shipping. The ratio was overwhelming. For every Japanese submarine at sea, the Americans could assign 7 or 8 hunters. In the waters surrounding the Philippines, around the Marianas, near the Carolines, Anywhere the Japanese submarines tried to operate, American anti-submarine groups waited. They had radar, they had sonar, they had depth charges, and ahead-throwing weapons. They had air support and coordination, and enough ships that losing one or two to torpedo attacks did not matter. They could absorb losses that would cripple the Japanese force. In February 1944, just 3 months after the devastating November losses, Japanese submarine I-32 departed Kure Naval Base for a patrol in the Marshall Islands. She carried 20 torpedoes and a crew of 94 men. She never reached her patrol area. American destroyers detected her crossing the Philippine Sea, hunted her for 18 hours, and sank her with depth charges. All hands lost. In March 1944, submarine I-42 was sent to intercept American shipping near New Guinea. She was detected by a patrol aircraft 2 days into her patrol. Destroyers converged. The hunt lasted 13 hours. I-42 was forced to surface and was destroyed by gunfire. 6 survivors were pulled from the water. 88 men died. In April 1944, submarine I-16, one of the larger fleet boats capable of carrying midget submarines for special operations, was caught by American destroyers off the Solomon Islands. The hunt lasted 31 hours, the longest recorded pursuit of a Japanese submarine during the war. I-16's commander tried everything. He went deep. He went shallow. He tried to hide in thermal layers. He tried to sneak away at 2 knots. He tried to sprint away at maximum speed. Nothing worked. The Americans maintained contact through every evasion attempt. When I-16 finally surfaced, her batteries completely dead, her crew could barely stand. The Americans ceased fire and offered to take survivors. The Japanese commander refused. He scuttled the submarine and went down with his boat. 102 men died. By mid-1944, the Imperial Japanese Navy's submarine force had ceased to be an effective combat arm. The boats still sailed. The crews still tried. But the mathematics were inescapable. Japanese submarines were being sunk faster than they could be built, faster than crews could be trained, faster than doctrine could adapt to American technological superiority. The loss rate in the first 6 months of 1944 was 28 submarines, nearly half the operational force. Some boats vanished without any record of their fate. They simply failed to return from patrol. No final radio message, no survivor reports, no confirmed sinking location. The ocean had swallowed them, and the only evidence of their passing was the empty berth at Kure or Yokosuka when the patrol was overdue. In July 1944, Japanese Naval General Staff conducted an analysis of submarine effectiveness. The report made devastating reading. From December 1941 through June 1944, Japanese submarines had sunk approximately 180 Allied merchant ships, totaling roughly 900,000 tons. They had sunk 1 aircraft carrier, USS Wasp. They had damaged several capital ships. But in that same period, Japan had lost 57 submarines, 57 boats, and over 4,000 trained submariners, an entire generation of naval expertise destroyed. The Americans had lost more submarines, nearly 60 boats, by mid-1944, but they had built 130 new submarines in the same period. Their force was growing. Japan's was dying. The report concluded with a recommendation that was never officially implemented, but which became de facto policy. Submarine operations should be limited to supply missions and transport of critical personnel. Offensive combat patrols should be discontinued, except in circumstances where success was nearly guaranteed. It was an admission of defeat. The weapon that was supposed to help win the war in the Pacific had been rendered obsolete by American industrial capacity and technological superiority. Commander Takeo Miki's final patrol, his 72 hours of being hunted by 12 destroyers, represented something larger than one submarine's death. It represented the end of the Japanese submarine force as a strategic weapon. The tactics that had worked in 1942, stealthy approach, torpedo attack, rapid evasion, no longer functioned against American destroyers, equipped with advanced sonar and practiced coordination. The individual skill and courage the Japanese submariners possessed in abundance could not overcome the systemic advantages the United States had built. Better sensors, better weapons, more ships, more aircraft, better training, better coordination, and behind everything, the industrial capacity to build destroyers faster than Japan could sink them, to replace losses faster than they accumulated, to sustain operations at a tempo that exhausted and destroyed the smaller Japanese force. In the years after the war, American naval historians analyzed the Pacific submarine campaign from both sides. The contrasts were stark. United States submarines, operating offensively against Japanese merchant shipping, sank over 1,300 Japanese vessels, totaling nearly 5 million tons. They destroyed 60% of Japan's merchant fleet, strangling the island nation's ability to import oil, rubber, food, and raw materials. Japanese submarines, operating under different doctrines and facing different opposition, sank a fraction of that tonnage and suffered proportionally higher losses. The difference was not courage or skill. Japanese submariners were as brave and as competent as their American counterparts. The difference was doctrine, technology, and industrial support. American submarines focused on merchant shipping, a target-rich environment where tonnage could accumulate. Japanese submarines focused on warships, heavily defended targets that were harder to find and harder to sink. American submarines operated with advanced torpedoes, though these had terrible problems early in the war, effective radar, and excellent intelligence, including decoded Japanese messages revealing convoy routes. Japanese submarines operated with less advanced technology and poorer intelligence about American fleet movements. American submarines that were damaged could return to forward bases at Pearl Harbor, Midway, or Australia for repairs that kept them operational. Japanese submarines damaged in combat often had to return to Japan for repairs, taking them out of action for months. And most critically, American submarines were supported by an anti-submarine warfare system focused on protecting their own boats while destroying the enemy's. The United States developed rescue procedures, submarine lifeguard missions, and coordination between boats that reduced American submarine losses even as American anti-submarine forces were destroying Japanese boats at an accelerating rate. By the end of 1944, the Imperial Japanese Navy's submarine force had effectively ceased to exist as a combat arm. Individual boats still sailed. Individual crews still carried out their orders with discipline and courage. But the coordinated force that had begun the war, the submarines that were supposed to sink American carriers and strangle Allied supply lines, had been reduced to scattered remnants operating in an ocean dominated by American power. The 8 submarines lost in the final week of November 1943, I-19 among them, were not casualties of one bad week or one failed operation. They were symptoms of a systemic collapse that had been building for months and would accelerate through the rest of the war. Commander Takeo Miki's 72 hours of being hunted represented the final proof that Japanese submarines could no longer operate in contested waters. The Americans had built a machine, a coordinated system of sensors and weapons and platforms and training and doctrine that could find submarines in the vastness of the Pacific and kill them with industrial efficiency. Individual bravery could not defeat that machine. Tactical excellence could not overcome it. Even technological innovation, had Japan possessed it, would have required years to implement. Years that the dying submarine force did not have. The question was never whether Commander Miki and his crew fought with courage. The records confirm they did. The question was whether courage could overcome systemic material superiority. November 19th through 27th, 1943, provided the answer. It could not. The Pacific Ocean is vast, over 60 million square miles. In that immensity, finding a single submarine should be impossible. It should be like searching for a grain of sand on a beach, a needle in a haystack, magnified to planetary scale. But by late 1943, the United States had turned that vast ocean into a killing ground where Japanese submarines could be detected, tracked, hunted, and destroyed with a consistency that defied the immensity of the battlefield. That transformation was not the result of one invention or one tactic. It was the product of industrial systems operating at a scale that Japan could not match and could not counter. Steel mills produce enough metal for hundreds of destroyers, shipyards launching escorts faster than they could be sunk, electronics factories manufacturing thousands of sonar sets and radar units, training schools producing crews by the hundreds, oil refineries supplied enough fuel that destroyers could hunt submarines for days without concern for consumption. Commander Takeo Miki understood this, probably not in analytical detail, but in the visceral knowledge that comes from being hunted for 72 hours by 12 ships that never broke contact, never gave up, never showed any limitation of endurance or resources. He understood that I-19 was not dying because her crew had failed or because he had made tactical errors. The submarine was dying because she was operating in an environment that had been engineered for her destruction. In his final minutes, standing on I-19's bridge, as shells tore through the hull and the ocean rose around him, Miki would have seen the American destroyers closing from every direction. Modern ships, well-maintained, crews that looked confident and professional. Behind them, invisible but undeniable, the industrial system that had built those ships and trained those crews and supplied them with everything needed to hunt submarines until none remained. That was what had killed I-19. Not one destroyer, not one battle. A system, an industrial machine that treated submarine hunting as a problem to be solved through technology, resources, coordination, and relentless application of force. Japan had entered the war believing that spirit and tactical skill could compensate for material disadvantages. By November 1943, the submarine force had learned the cost of that belief. The 8 boats lost in 1 week, the hundreds of men who died in steel coffins at the bottom of the Pacific, the commanders who fought with courage and skill and died anyway because courage and skill were not enough. The Imperial Japanese Navy's submarine force continued operations through 1945, but the war that mattered, the contest for control of the Pacific sea lanes, had been decided by the end of 1943, decided not by battles or tactics or heroic actions, but by production lines and radar sets and sonar operators and the quiet, systematic efficiency of a nation that had industrialized warfare to a degree that smaller opponents could not match. Commander Takeo Miki's final patrol was a footnote in that larger story. One submarine among dozens lost, one commander among hundreds killed. But I-19's 72 hours of being hunted illustrated with brutal clarity what that industrialized warfare meant for the men trapped inside obsolete weapons, fighting a war they could not win against an enemy they could not escape. The American destroyers that killed I-19 did not act from hatred or revenge. They acted from doctrine, procedure, and technological advantage. They found the submarine because their sonar was effective. They tracked her because their coordination was practiced. They killed her because they had the weapons, the time, and the resources to hunt until the submarine could no longer hide. It was not personal. It was industrial. And that made it more terrible, more complete, and more final than any individual battle could ever be. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.